lot of students ask about international medical schools, and it may be a decent choice for some particular students. I want to take some time to talk about these different institutions. The first thoughts are that there are two different types of international schools, right? There are those that are actually in country, let's say in India or China, that train physicians who mostly are going to stay within their own countries. But then there's a whole slew of international medical schools that actually cater on US-based medical students who maybe couldn't get into a medical school in the United States. These are primarily focused in the Caribbean, but can be found actually in Australia, in Mexico, and in other countries as well. An IMG is an international medical school graduate, and these can be one of two different graduates. One, they can be a graduate who is actually a true international citizen. They may be from India or China or another country. Or two, an international medical graduate may be a student who is US based, a US student or a Canadian student who went to college in the United States but decided to go to another country for their medical training. Now, as a prospective medical student, considering international medical schools can be a double-edged sword. Some of these schools can be really great and it can be a really interesting alternative pathway. But it's really essential to understand that they all come with their own sets of pros and cons. Actually, the New York Times recently wrote an article about Caribbean medical schools, and one of the quotes in there was that the attrition rate of some of the schools can be eye-poppingly high, and the quality of education varies widely. In my experience, this is true. Schools like St. George's may have up to 1,000 plus kids in their incoming class, but only a couple hundred maybe make it all the way to the match. What happens to the other 800? Well, they eventually get weeded out of that school over time. Even worse, some of those students might get to the match and end up not matching, which would be one of the worst case scenarios because you have just invested thousands upon thousands of dollars into your education and not ended up matching into a residency, so you can't practice. But even with these downsides, these schools have become a really significant source of doctors in the United States, especially in primary care specialties. If you think about the way the match works, basically there are more slots than US physicians who graduate every single year. So if we look at the most recent data from the NRMP, which is the match website, it tells us a lot more about how IMG students have the ability to match or not. Let's dive into some of that data. So here's what the data shows. Of the 4,963 US international medical graduates, again, these are US-based students who went to international medical school, 3,000 or so of them matched. That's a 67% match rate. Let's compare that up against US citizens who actually went to school in the United States. Well, those students actually had about a 90+% match rate, and that includes MD and DO students. That's a huge difference. Just going to a US-based school increases your match possibilities by almost 30% or more. That's why for a lot of students, I would actually recommend going through 2 rounds of US-based applications before deciding to apply to international medical school. It can just make a huge impact in your overall career.
If you're finding this video helpful, don't forget to check out the full course using the link in the description below for more in-depth content.
Let's talk a little bit about the clinical education at some of these schools, which can be varied. Basically, these schools need and will send their students back to the United States for a lot of their clinical rotations, but students will struggle to sometimes get placed in hospitals at these institutions. That's because they have a limited number of slots, and sometimes they even get sent to hospitals that don't have a tremendous amount of specialization. I know students from international schools, for instance, who are actually sent to a psychiatry hospital for their internal medicine rotation. And honestly, it's not a great learning experience. That said, there are tremendous successes that come from these institutions. There are students who go down there and will come back and secure impressive residency slots. They'll get great USMLE scores, they'll do research, and they'll get into really hard specialties. The student who probably makes most sense for international schools are those students who maybe didn't do as well as they wanted to in undergrad, but they have the propensity to do better. Maybe they partied too hard and they simply came out with a poor GPA, but they knew they could do a whole lot better than that. And they had a light bulb moment. They said, I'm going to change my academic career and I'm going to do better. But I don't have the grades to get into a US school. That's a perfect candidate for an international school because that person can go down there, study their butt off, do really well in the USMLE, and come back and match here. In fact, let me give you an example of a student who I worked with personally who decided that he wanted to do interventional radiology as a career. This was his story. He basically went to a school in undergrad and didn't do as well as he wanted to. But he knew he had the ability to. He just partied his butt off. And so what he did was he said, I'm going to take this flyer, go down to the Caribbean, and I'm going to work my butt off this time. And so he did. He got a 260 on the USMLE. He was able to maintain great grades. He even did research in interventional radiology and ended up matching into one of the most competitive fields there was that match year. In fact, this same student ended up coming back and working with MedSchoolCoach as a tutor as well as an advisor for international medical graduates. So you can really do exceptional work if you put your mind to it. The student who might not be great there is the student who struggled all through college but worked really hard anyway. And so that person might go down there and not have as great an experience because despite the studying that they put in, they just don't do as well as they wanted to on some of the standardized tests or in rotations. And that person may struggle to graduate or match eventually. A couple other things to keep in mind about these international schools. Because IMGs tend to match into less competitive residencies like internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, if you're interested in these specialties, it's reasonable to take a chance at a Caribbean medical school. But if you're really interested in a surgical subspecialty, let's say, then again, it might be worth going to 2 or more application processes in the United States, trying to improve your grades in other ways before you go down there. In summary, there are lots of really good options in international medical schools, but you have to choose them carefully. One thing I also want to note is that there are a bunch of schools that will actually say, hey, don't even take the MCAT. Come on down here. We don't require the MCAT. I would steer away from them. I would only choose an international school that has a large contingent of students, now physicians, back in the United States, has a good alumni network, and has a really good hospital network for you to tap into. If all these things are true, and you decide that you're a student who can't get into a US-based medical school, then an international medical school might be a great option for you. But be careful of your decision and make sure to weigh all the considerations before deciding that this is the right pathway for you. Again, somebody at MedSchoolCoach, one of our advisors, can really help you make this informed decision to make sure that you don't make a critical mistake of spending 4 years in another country and never being able to practice in the United States.
Thank you for watching. For the complete course, click the link in the description below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more previews and updates.